On this video, I would like to continue what I've been doing in the book of Job. That is, talking my way through the book, reading the Hebrew, and doing a grammatical analysis along with a brief commentary. We now come to Elihu's final words. We have completed all the chapters up to this point, as well as the chapter 38 to the end of the book. So at this point, in chapter 36, verse 1 to 37:24, Elihu continues his monologue after justifying himself as one to listen to. He argues that God judges the wicked and rewards the righteous. He disciplines men in suffering, and the manner in which they receive it determines whether they perish or not. All of this in the first 15 verses of this chapter. Those then who harden their hearts and hearken not to his discipline perish. Those who, though, obey will spend their days in prosperity, similar to what's been argued throughout by his friends. Job is then warned that his own attitudes must be right, whereas they have not been. Elihu comes to the end of his speech and then will encourage Job to study God's infinite greatness and wisdom. Not a lot of new things brought in by Elihu in the argument, but let me pick up in verse 1, Vayosef Elihu Vayomar, and Elihu continued and said. Yosef is from Yasaf. It's a Hifil imperfect third masculine singular from Yasaf. Historically, I believe Vasaf, and with a Vav consecutive. So he also proceeded or continued and said, Vayomer, cow imperfect third masculine singular from Amar, with a Vav conversive or a Vav consecutive. Katar li Zair ve'ahavecha ki od le'aloha milim. That is, permit me or suffer me a little, and I will tell you. For yet there are words on God's behalf, or for God there are words. Qatar is a PL imperative masculine singular from Qatar, that is, permit me or suffer me a little, and I will tell you. The ahave is from Chava. It's the PL imperfect first common singular from Chava, and Ha, the final Ha, is your pronominal suffix second masculine singular with a Vav consecutive or a Vav conversive. For yet, for God, there are words, or there are words on behalf of God. Elihu now begins his fourth speech by asking his listeners to be polite and listen to him for a while longer. And so we continue in verse 3. Esa dei lemerachot. I will bring forth my knowledge, or lift up my knowledge from far off, afar. U lepo'ali etain tzedek. And I will ascribe righteousness to my Maker. Esa is the cow imperfect first common singular from nasa, a pay noon verb where the noon has assimilated into the scene here. So I will lift up my knowledge from afar and to my Maker. Ule fo ali is from pa'al, to do or make. Here we have a cow participle, masculine singular, with the pronominal suffix first common singular from pa'al, preceded by the lamed, that is the preposition. To my Maker I will give righteousness, or ascribe righteousness. Attain is from natan, a cow imperfect first common singular from natan. Notice the pay noon verb here. The noon has assimilated into the tav, entain becoming attain. That's why we have the doubling of the tav here. And so in verse 3, he argues, seek to show God's righteousness in contrast to Job's charge that God is unjust, going back to chapter 34, verses 10 to 12. And then we continue then in the next verse. Ki amnam lo sheker milai, for truly my words, they are not false. Temim deot imat, and one who is upright, temim, in mind is with you, or in thought. One who is upright in thought is with you. And so what he is saying here is that he believes he should be listened to, for he feels that his words are not false, and that as an upright man, he can speak only what is true. So we see Elihu is justifying himself here as one to be listened to. So verse 5, it continues, Hein el kabir velo yim'az. Behold, God is mighty, and he does not despise any, understood, I think here. Kabir koach lev. He is mighty of strength of understanding. In other words, God is mighty with understanding. Lo yim'as is from ma'as, to despise. It's the cow imperfect third masculine singular. And so what Elihu is saying here is, although God is mighty, he does not despise any person. Reasons Elihu, being mighty in his understanding, though, he searches out what is right in each person. And so he continues in verse 6. Lo yechaveh rashat. He does not preserve or give to preserve the life of the wicked. Umishpat aniyim yitain. And to the poor he gives, we could say, and the justice due, or the right uh, of the poor he gives. He gives the right of the poor. In other words, he looks out for the poor. Lo yechaveh, the root is hava, or haya, I should say, and it's a it's a PL imperfect, third masculine singular from chaya. So he does not preserve the life of the wicked, to give life, chaya, and the judgment of the poor he gives. In other words, he though gives the proper judgment to the poor. Yatain is the cow imperfect third masculine singular from Natan, another pay noon verb where the noon has assimilated by progressive assimilation into the tav. So in verse 6, what he's saying here is, as such, God does not reward the wicked by preserving their life, but he gives aid to the poor and the afflicted. Not so much new in the argument of what he's presenting that the others haven't presented. So then in verse 7, it continues, Lo yigra mitzadik einav. He does not withdraw from the righteous his eyes. Va'et melachim lekisei. But with kings on the throne, he sets them via shivim lenetzach vayigbahu. He sets them forever, and they are exalted. As we look at this, he notice he does not withdraw from the righteous his eyes. Yikra is the cow imperfect third masculine singular from gara, to withdraw. So he does not withdraw his eyes from the righteous, but with kings to their throne, he basically sets them forever. He places them or sets them. Notice yeshivim is from shuv, to return or to set them. He sets them forever, and they vayigva'u, they are exalted. Another cow imperfect third masculine plural from gaba, to lift up or to be exalted. And so basically what he's saying here is that God will not withdraw his eyes from the righteous, but he exalts them as though they were princes or kings. Seems to be the thought here. In other words, to follow the flow, he exalts them as if they were kings and princes. So now we come to verses 8 to 10, and he's going to talk about those that are afflicted. So verses 8 to 10, we continue hearing Elihu's argument. The im asurim bazekim, or bazekim, yela chedon bechavle oni. And if they are bound in fetters, asurim is a cow passive participle masculine plural from asar, to bind, and they are held yela chedun, from lakad, Here we have a nifal imperfect, third masculine plural from lakad. They are held with chavle oni, with cords of affliction. Then he declares unto them their word. Vayaged lahem pa olam. Vayaged is from nagad, a penun verb. It's a hifel imperfect, third masculine singular from nagad. So he causes to declare to them their work. U pishehem ki yit ga baru, and their transgressions, that they have behaved arrogantly or proudly. A hit pael imperfect, third masculine plural from gabar. So they have elevated themselves and behaved proudly. And vayegel oznav lemusar, he opens also their ear to discipline. He unveils their ear to discipline. Yegel is from Gala, the cow imperfect lamed hey verb, third masculine singular from Gala, with a vav hafek or a vav conversive. So he opens or reveals their ears to discipline. And vayomer bi yeshuvun me aven. And he speaks, and we could probably render this says or commands, that they return from iniquity. Yeshuvun is from shuv. It's the cow imperfect, third masculine plural from shuv, to return. And so in these verses 8 to 10, in light of God's justice and faithfulness, if some are afflicted, God is seeking to teach them that they are transgressors and must have behaved proudly. Affliction, then, for a disciplinary purpose, is to capture the attention of the transgressor and command a return away from their iniquity. And that seems to be really the same argument that the friends have argued. So the bottom line, Elihu is not really adding a lot of anything new much, except the whole idea of discipline seems to be his emphasis. So then in verses 12 to 14, if these who are afflicted won't listen, then they will suddenly perish. And so reading in verses 12 to 14, it reads, Ve'im lo yishma'u b'shelach ya'avoru. And if they will not hear by the sword, they shall perish or pass away. Ishma'u is from shama, to hear, the cow imperfect, third masculine plural from shama, and then ya'avoru, they shall perish, from avar, the cow imperfect, third masculine plural. And they shall die without knowledge. Vayigva'u bibli da'at. Vayigva'u, they shall perish without knowledge. This is the cow imperfect, third masculine plural from gava. So they shall perish without knowledge. But, and so we could say, the godless in heart lay up anger. V'hanfei lev yasimu av. The ones who are godless of heart. Here we have two nouns in construct. the godless ones of heart. They shall lay up anger. Yasimu is a middle weak verb seem, cow imperfect, third masculine plural. They cry not, lo yeshavu ki asara. They do not cry for help, seems to be the thought, to cry out for, or they do not cry for help uh, when he binds them. Yeshavu is a PL imperfect, third masculine plural from shava, to cry, for he binds them, or when he binds them. Asaram, asar, to bind, followed by the pronominal suffix, kal, perfect, third masculine singular from asar, followed by the pronominal suffix, third masculine plural. And so as a result, their soul perishes. Tamot ba noar nafsham. And so their soul dies or perishes in youth. Tamot is from mot. It's the cow imperfect, third feminine singular from mot. So their soul, it perishes in their life. V'chayatam ba kedeshim. Their life as that of those that are accursed or the wicked. And so the point here in these verses, beginning at verse 12 to 14, is talking about those who won't listen. If these being afflicted won't listen to God's discipline, they will perish suddenly without knowledge. The unrighteous, instead of crying out to God for help in their affliction, really lay up anger against God and wrongly attack him, as Job had done. As a result, these die at an early age, seems to be the thought at this point. So in verse 15, it continues, Yechaletz ani be'onyo, he delivers the afflicted by his affliction. Yechaletz is the PL imperfect, third masculine singular from chalatz. He delivers the afflicted by his infliction, onyo, and he opens their ear by yigel belachatz oznam. He opens or unveils with tribulation their ear. Vayigel is the cow imperfect, third masculine singular from the root gala, a lamed he verb, and so he opens their ear by tribulation. So verse 15, those who take discipline and open their eye to it are finally delivered, argues Elihu. So in verses 16 to 21 then, Job is now exhorted to personally take heed to discipline and respond to God's justice. He is not to be angry nor to trust in his own strength or wealth for deliverance. So we continue hearing similar arguments that the friends have brought forth. The only difference that I can find here is the whole idea of discipline. But I think that was somewhat alluded to even by his friends. So 16, he continues then, and va'af hasitecha mipi tsar. Indeed, he has allured you from distress. Hasitecha is from seed. It's a hiphil perfect, third masculine singular, followed by the pronominal suffix in the ha. Rahav lo mutzak tak teha. He's allured you into a broad place where there is no straightness uh, instead of it. In other words, he's led you into a broad place where there is no straightness. The nahat shulchanacha malay dashin. And what is set of your table is full of fatness. And so in verse 16, the thought is God had desired to bring Job away from his sufferings into a broad place of relief and to experience a table full of fatness, which depicts God's blessing. However, Job had judged God in a wrong way. And so in verse 7, he continues, V'din rasha maleta, and judgment of the wicked you are full of. Maleta is the Cal perfect second masculine singular from Malay. You are full of the judgment of the wicked. Din umishpat yitmahu. Judgment and justice take hold on them. In other words, judgment and justice take hold on the wicked. Here we have another thought here, again, accusing Job. Notice, Job, however, had judged God as unjust, along with what other wicked men had done, and thus God's discipline has become God's judgment because he didn't respond to the discipline. Elihu is arguing that God was trying to give to him to help him. Then in verse 18, Elihu then continues. Ki chama pen yasitecha veshafek. For be aware of wrath, lest you be led away by your sufficiency, your supposed sufficiency. Yasitecha is a hiphil imperfect. Lest you be led away, a cow imperfect, second person singular from seat, followed by the pronominal suffix in the cha, second masculine singular. Lest, for beware of chama, wrath, lest you be led away with your sufficiency. V'rab kofer al yatecha. And the greatness of your ransom, uh, do not let it turn you aside. In other words, neither let the greatness of your ransom cause to turn you aside. Yatecha is from nata, a hiphil, imperfect, third masculine singular, followed by the pronominal suffix ha, to turn aside. And as we look at verse 18, what he seems to be saying there is Elihu warns Job not to be carried away by his wrath and the greatness of his suffering into a full rebellion against God. Don't let that happen. And so in verse 19, he then continues. Haya arok shuhacha lo vatsar. Will your riches or wealth avail that are without a narrow kind of a stint? In other words, or your forces, v'chol ma'amatse hoa, or all the forces of your strength. Ha ya'avur from ha ya'arok from arak, to avail, the cow imperfect third masculine singular preceded by the interrogative hey. So will your riches avail? And I think the thought here in this verse, Job basically cannot escape his afflictions by means either of his great wealth or riches or any personal power. In other words, that won't allow you to escape what is going on. And so in verse 20, the text continues, Al tis'af halayla, do not desire the night. Tish'af from sha'af, it's the cow imperfect second masculine singular from sha'af. Adjective idea. Do not desire the night. La alot amim taktam, to lift away or to cut off people from under themselves. In other words, when people are cut off, actually we could say taktam could be their place. So when people are cut off in their place. And so in verse 20, the thought seems to be Job is not to desire a sudden nighttime type of calamity that many suddenly experience as a relief from suffering. And so in verse 21, Job is to take heed and not continue to add to his suffering. So, Hishamer al tefen al oven. Take heed and do not regard iniquity. Hishamer is an imperative, and it's a hiphil imperative, masculine singular. Take heed. Actually, excuse me, It's an IA vowel pattern, so it would be a nif vowel, imperative, masculine singular, from shamar, hin shamer, becoming his shamer. So take heed and do not turn unto iniquity, for ki al zeh bacharta me oni. For upon this you have chosen rather than affliction. Bacharta is the cow perfect second masculine singular from Bachar. So in verse 21, Job is thus to take heed and not add iniquity to his suffering by rebelling against God, which is what, according to Elihu, Job has chosen. So from verses 22 to 33 now, God's infinite greatness and lofty wisdom is now set forth. Since neither Job nor any can really understand his dealings, it is better to accept them rather than rebelling. So now he's going to focus on God's power and recognizing it and coming under it, receiving it for the discipline that God is trying to give, seems to be the thought. So verse 22 reads, Hein al yasgi behoah. Behold, God deals in a lofty way in power. Yasgiv is a Hiphil imperfect third masculine singular from Sagav. And who like him is a teacher. Mi hamohu mora. Who is like him that is such a teacher? And what God, the thought here is God is lofty in his sovereign power. Who really can teach him? He alone is capable of teaching men, and you're to accept that, Job, seems to be the idea. So in verse 23, he then continues in the Hebrew, Mi fakad alav darko. Who has met upon him in his way, or who has enjoined him in his way, or visit concerning him in his way. Umi amar pa'alta avla, or who has said, you have done unrighteousness to God. Pa'alta is the cow perfect second masculine singular from pa'al. And pakad is the cow perfect third masculine singular from pakad, to visit or enjoin concerning him of his way or in his way. So in verse 23, who can say that God has done unrighteously? Or who can pass judgment on his acts as Job has endeavored to do? Again, he's coming back to continuing to critique Job's previous actions. So in verse 24, remember, Zechor ki tasgi pa olo. Remember that you magnify his work. Zechor is a cow imperative masculine singular from zakad. Remember that you are caused to magnify his work. A tasgi from saga, to magnify, a hiphil imperfect second masculine singular. Asher shoraru anashim, where men have sung. Sharar, to sing. cow imperfect third common plural. And so the thought in verse 24, Job's job is really to magnify God's works, whereof men in the past have sung about it. It is not his to attack and question, is what Elihu is implying. And we continue then in verse 25. Kol Adam Hazuvo, all men have looked there. Hazah is the root here, the cow perfect third common plural from Hazah. All men have looked in it, and Anosh Yabit Merachot, and man sees from afar. Yabit is a Hiphil imperfect third masculine singular from Nabat. And so in verse 25, man can only see God's working from a distance. They are so awesome. And we continue then in verse 26. Behold, God is great. Hein el sagi velo neda. Behold, God is great, and he cannot be known, or we cannot know. Mispar shana velo cheker. And the number of his years are not searchable, or are, we could say, unsearchable. So basically in verse 26, in light of all this, man really cannot comprehend God. He is beyond human understanding, for he is infinite. The finite cannot possibly probe the infinite. And so in verses 27 and 28, this greatness of God now is seen in the way he forms the rain and brings forth the rain upon men. 27 then reads, Ki yigra nitfe mayim, for he draws away the drops of water, draws them. Yegaresh. Here we have a PO imperfect third masculine singular from gara. He draws away the drops of water which distill Yezoku matar le'edo, which distill rain from his vapor. So the thought here, and then let me just read verse 28 and summarize the thought. Asher yizlu shechakim yirafu ale adam rab, which the skies pour down and drop upon the multitude of men, upon men of multitude, upon many men, or upon the multitudes of men. Yerafu is the cow imperfect third masculine singular from ra'af, to drop, and yizlu is from the root to pour, which pour down, which the skies, I should say, shechakim, pour down and drop upon the multitudes of men. And so in verse 28, taking these two verses together, as we said, the greatness of God then, repeating what we said, is seen in the way he forms the rain and brings forth the rain upon all of the human kind or human race. So verse 29, he continues talking about God's tent is in the thunder cloud. So verse 29 continues, Af im yavin mifreshe av. Indeed, can any understand the spreadings of the cloud? Yavin is the cow imperfect, third masculine singular from being. Can any understand or cause to understand the crashing of the pavilion? Teshuot Sukkato, of his pavilion. And so in verse 29, God's tent is the thundercloud as he utters forth his voice from the crashing sound of thunder from his pavilion. All of this beautiful imagery is given then to illustrate God's great power and God's greatness. Verse 30, he continues, Indeed, af im yavin mifreshe of. Indeed, or yes, can any understand the spreading of the clouds, the crashing of his pavilion? Behold, hein parash alav oro. Behold, he spreads upon it his light. Parash is the cow perfect, third masculine singular from parash. And the depths of the sea, Sharashe Chayim, Kisa, he covers. Kisa is the PL perfect, third masculine singular from Kasa, to cover. And so in verse 30, upon his tent, the dark clouds, he spreads forth the bright flashes of lightning. And it's looking again at the thunderstorm and God's power. That's a theme that we have also throughout a lot of the Hebrew Bible. An example would be Psalm 29. And then we continue in verse 31. Kivam Yadin Amim. For by those he judges the peoples. Yitain Ochel Lemakbir. And he gives food for abundance. Yitain is the cow in perfect third masculine singular from Natan, a Peinun verb. So the thought here is all of these things, the rain, the thunder, and the lightning, are used to judge mankind and bring terror to him, as well as to give food for man after the storm ends. So again, he's focusing on God's greatness, and Job should recognize that rather than seeking to attack him and justifying himself. And so in verse 32, Al Kapayim Kisa Or, he covers, verse 32, with the lightning, he covers his hand, over his hands, he covers, I guess we could say, the lightning, or with the lightning. Kisa is the PL perfect third masculine singular from kasa, to cover, and gives it a charge. Vayetzav alecha be mafgia, and charges concerning it, not that it strike the mark. In striking the mark, mafgia is a hifil participle masculine singular from paga, to strike. and Vayatsav from Sava, PL imperfect, third masculine singular with a Vav conversive or a Vav consecutive. So God fills his hand with the lightning bolts, and it's interesting, and throws them at his mark. One is reminded of the Baal text in the Ugaritic literature, where Baal throws down the lightning. But here, God is the one who fills his hand with lightning bolts, is the idea, and throws them at the mark. And then finally, in verse 33, the noise thereof, Yagid alav re'o, its noise he declares upon it, or concerning it. Yagid is the Ifil imperfect third masculine singular from not God, and Migneh af al oleh, that is, and the cattle also, concerning the storm that comes up. The cattle indeed concerning the storm. The thought again concluding here is the noise of thunder announces God's presence, and even the cattle are aware that God has spoken and a storm is coming up. They become aware of that, is the thought here. So, as we're looking at what Elihu seems to be arguing, summarizing it again, he justifies himself to be listened to in the first 4 verses. He then argues that God judges the wicked and rewards the righteous in verses 5 to 7. He disciplines man in suffering, and the manner in which they receive it determines whether they perish or not. Verses 8 to 15. Those then who harden their hearts and do not hearken to his discipline will perish, but those who obey will spend their lives in prosperity. Job is then warned that his own attitude must be right, whereas they have not been. In other words, he has to change his attitude. Verses 16 to 21. And then, as we've seen, Elihu comes to the end of his speech by encouraging Job to look at God's greatness and his wisdom, and to learn from that he needs to subject to the discipline that God is putting him through.